I love what you said about being your own cheerleader and being your own kind of supporter and so on and so forth. But I want a follow-up question with that. How did you manage to become your own cheerleader? Because when we're young, when we're kids, it's very difficult to do that. It has to be external. But how do you transfer this external validation to an internal validation?
For me, it came in undergrad. It came in undergrad when I finally like detached from my family. They were in Italy. I went back to Canada. And I think that's when like I really like, you know, the little like seedling, like I put it in an open field and it was like either you survive or you dry up. And I just like started to do a lot of different projects that I didn't have the opportunity to do them where I spent my teenage years. So it's a wonderful place, but in the south of Italy, but it just didn't have the same types of projects and opportunity. The school I was in, I had to know Italian. That's why the example of she doesn't speak Italian. The closest English school was 4 hours away in Naples. So either I learned Italian or I didn't go to school. Like there was no like you couldn't just choose to go to an English speaking school. There was nothing. And so when I went to undergrad is when I met people. Some people put me really down. Most really helped me lift me up. And those who lifted me up were saying, why don't you try this? Why don't you go to this club? And so I subscribed myself into every club, every opportunity, every like, I was, you know, when you see those movies that it's like, hi, I'm like president of the, I was that kid. I was possibly the annoying one. Now that now like 11 years later, I was like, wow, I see watch movies. I'm like, I really hope I wasn't like that. But I got super involved in the most random things ever. And the times that I succeeded in those, I was like, oh, cool. Like I actually took a step back and thought, oh, cool. Like I managed to do that. I had never like heard about this topic before. That's cool. Maybe I'll take a course on it. Maybe I'll do like this. And I think bit by bit, like the tiny wins, the really small ones, I kind of like in my mind, I was like, oh, cool, I did that. Oh, this course I had no background on that you needed a background on. I got a really good grade on that. Cool, check. And so I think what I did over those years was like accumulate these tiny little boxes of like success. And I was always also the person who would I just shoot my shot. Like in basketball, I would shoot my shot. I never got the hoop. It's okay. But like in undergrad, if there was an application, come the fourth year, that's when really like my life changed because I took 3 years of like little successes, put them in my pocket. Come the fourth year, I applied for everything, every conference, every speech, every like whatever it was, I was applying. And I remember I really wanted to go to this leadership program in Dubai, but I couldn't afford it. And so I needed to get scholarships, but there was no scholarship in my school for something like that. So I went to the president's office every week for like 2 months and to like saying like, okay, this is why I need to do this, blah, blah. And when I went into the office, like, I don't know, for the 11th time, one of the admin, he was Australian, and I can't replicate the Australian accent, but in his Australian accent, he was like, "You're a persistent little sucker."
Annoying works. Annoying works sometimes.
And it was so funny in how he said it, and I feel like I should like frame that because that's who I became. I became a persistent little sucker, and and I wouldn't stop. And when I managed that, and then I started an organization, started a nonprofit. I did research. I convinced my professors to let me do exams earlier so I could go to like Pakistan and Oman to do research. I mean, there were so many things that I did that at that point I graduated and I was like, cool, I can do anything. And it comes with like being 22, 23, and I had graduated, and then I didn't get into a master's program that I really wanted. So I had accumulated all these successes. I thought I could do anything. I told myself I could do anything. And then in my mind, I was like, I have to go to this one program. And so that's the only master's I applied for. And I was going to go straight out of undergrad. Well, surprise, surprise, I didn't get it, even though everyone said I would have. And that's when it all came crashing again. And I was like, oh, what am I going to do? I was super lost. And so I spent 4 months, half in nature, half in doing random things. And then one day, and I felt kind of like upset, kind of lost. And one day, my dad trying to encourage me, he sent me a newsletter, like, look at this newsletter, they have jobs there. So I see one, and it was at the UN, and it said, you need a master's degree in an environmental or semi-related technical field and you need experience is preferred. I just came out of undergrad with international relations. And in my mind, I was like, I'm qualified. And so, because I published this one paper once on desertification, like, I'm so qualified for this. And so I did it. I got the spark back. I shot my shot. I did the I didn't know anyone. I mean, this was like completely external. And you know the UN, how it works, how difficult it is to come in externally. And I did the interview. I talked about my paper, my blah, blah. And then they got me and I went. And I think that's when, like, boom, again, I got the confidence. So I learned that, like, okay, obviously you're not going to have every success, obviously, because otherwise, like, that's not life. Like, that's not reality. You can't just succeed. But that anytime I really wanted, like, really, really wanted something, and it was the right next step, that I could achieve it. And I think that's what gave me, like, just shooting that shot, even though, and I never limit myself because of, like, oh, this is the criteria. I don't care about what criteria they've written, because to be honest, in the past, like, since that happened, past 8 years, almost every opportunity I've gotten, I have not matched the criteria. My startup has not made the minimum monthly revenue. I still got that program. It wasn't in the right field. Still got that. Like, now I don't care. I don't give a beep about criteria, because I've realized that there's always an exception. Always an exception, and that's, like, if I really think it's worthwhile and it's worth my time trying to shoot that shot, I'll go for it.
It's really valuable, and I think that's really important for people to remember. It's a difficult idea, because here in Finland, and for the past 10 years, I've been dealing with this specific sort of cultural outlook. There's this idea that the rules are the rules. And this is sort of an unspoken rule here in Finland, and pretty much everybody follows it without thinking about it. It's not something questioned. If something doesn't fit, they don't necessarily have the flexibility, the adaptability to be able to figure out what to do with an exception. And so a lot of people will have difficulty here integrating into the Finnish culture, working into the business and work world, because of that odd disconnect with the inability to handle exceptions. Because effectively, if you're multicultural, you're coming from a very different world. You're used to adapting to at least some extent, and you're used to not necessarily fitting into expectations. But I think that that's a really important aspect of adaptability. I'd like to ask specifically, as far as that multicultural background, how do you think that those experiences really help to shape or mold your view of the world itself?
I think it really helps in how I see others at a certain in certain environments. So I'll give like a quick practical example. I had participated in a Japanese Canada program, and two Canadian, it's called JCAC, two Canadian students, two Japanese. We went to Tokyo, we did different programs, sit on a project, work on it. And it was such a collision of two worlds. We were working on aging cities and society, and they don't have enough caretakers for the elderly. And so the Canadian side, we work on the project, she was saying, okay, well, you can change some immigration laws to allow more people to income, so you fill in that gap for caretakers, because at the time, this is such a long time ago, 100,000 caretakers were lacking in Japanese society. The elderly needed help. And our Japanese team said, oh no, we're not ready for that, because they'll have kids and they need new schools, and we're not ready for that, like that's too soon. And so she said, okay, what's the solution? Robots, said the Japanese side. Like we have robots, the technology is already here. We'll just like need to produce more of them and all good. And the girl on the Canadian side said, if I give my grandma a robot, she's gonna throw the robot out the window and tell me, you stay here and help me out. Like there's no way my grandma's gonna be okay with a robot. But the Japanese side was. And it was like this collision of two worlds, how we see the same problem, elderly care, and one wants immigration and the other one wants robotics. And and how do we match this? And then the professor that was helping guide this specific session, he sat us down and he gave us like a little course on cross communication. And he was saying how on the Japanese side, if they say it's difficult, it means it's a hard no. Like it's difficult means no, it's not happening, but it's not polite to say no. And so when they sat down with the American team was saying, okay, it's difficult, like how can we problem solve? Like what's the problem? How can we solve it? And the Japanese side, super confused, kept saying, no, it's difficult. Like and so there was this clash. And so how this one example is that in most conversations that now I participate in most environments, I see myself a little bit as that prof on the outside that understood how these two were talking. Because and obviously there's so many other environments that I haven't been in, but in general, I can mostly relate to environments where people may be coming from Latin America, North America, Europe, Asia, the African continent, and understand that the reason why these people are not understanding or just not getting them, there's like these tiny little nonverbal or cultural things that are happening. And so what it's given me is the ability to have a wider lens and be able to communicate better, even when I don't speak the language. Like I don't speak Korean, but somehow I managed to communicate when I was in outside of Seoul in the temple with the monk. Like it's so I think that that's very important. And for me, this only happened by being thrown in there, like had no choice, but then taking a step back and observing how people eat, how people talk, how they think, who talks first, who bows their head first, who touches hands, who doesn't. And so I think that only comes from like really being thrown into the environment. But that now that's given me a much better sense of understanding of where people come from, where when they say this one sentence or they do this one thing, and making and preventing that conflict comes from that, because most times conflict comes from miscommunication and misunderstanding. Two people saying the same thing, how to take care of grandma, but one's on immigration, the other one's on robotics. And I think like for me, it's changed my worldview, because I feel like I mostly kind of get it. I don't agree. Many times, of course, I don't agree with the situation. There are many cases of gender discrimination and violence and conflict that I don't agree with at all. But at least I understand why they're saying it and where they're coming from. And I think this helps in across literally everything, in friendship, in business, in whatever it might be, just this observing of how people, where they come from. Not place-wise, just like how they act.
It works in politics and international relations. A lot of the problems that we are now facing, be it offline or online, result from this lack of, I would say, first there's lack of empathy, which is the emotional side of things. But then behind that, there's another layer, which is more intellectual, which is the lack of understanding of where this other person comes from, of the thought process that preceded this reaction or this behavior or this approach or this whatever it is that is happening on the ground. And I think in the 21st century, we desperately need that kind of bridge between different cultures, between different perspectives, between different approaches, because otherwise it's like screaming at the top of your lungs in a language that another person doesn't understand, and you're standing behind a wall. There's no other way for the other person to understand what's happening, why the other person is screaming. And matter of fact, you're screaming because you're overjoyed, and they think you need help, or you scream because you need help, and the other person would think you're overjoyed. And it's funny to say it this way, but it can end up in a lot of disasters, business-wise, friendship-wise, communication-wise, in politics, in religion, in across a variety of different fields.
Even
that being said, yeah.
Just on a practical perspective, when I started working with refugee women in the kitchen in Dafero, they wouldn't shake hands, wouldn't look in the eye, would look down, would be more quiet. If it rained, they would send me a text message, "It's raining today, so my husband doesn't want me to take the train, raining." And if I hadn't spent time in the Middle East as a, like, let's say, traditional employer, I would think that, like, oh, doesn't look in the eye is not trustworthy or is lying. You know, this cultural imposition, because I knew this relatively different thing about the rain and not leaving the house when it rains. I understood where they came from, and I was able to give them a counter training on, like, what happens in other contexts and how to help them out. And so I really think it's important, really, from a practice, not even abstract, but like everyday inclusion, from an inclusion perspective, because they don't know. The other doesn't know what that's how where their world is coming from.